Shalom, friends. It's wonderful to be together again. Familiar faces, new faces, and another webinar that is offered through the co-sponsorship of Chidush, Ruach Chidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality, J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. Today we are having, based on popular demand and wonderful collaboration with Professor Rivka Weill, and without further ado, with just one more announcement, I'll turn it over to Judge Peter Buxbaum, co-chair of J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, to introduce Professor Weill and moderate this webinar. So the one announcement is, I hope to see you all and possibly your friends, colleagues, and others in 2 weeks from today, Monday, March 8th, in a second session following the last one, dealing with the upcoming elections in Israel. It's getting closer to the elections, and we hope in 2 weeks to be able to bring to you candidates from the parties that were not represented in the last webinar, and some further data from election polls, and some reference to how the process is unfolding and what we may expect as a result. We will certainly meet again after the elections to discuss this, but for the time being, I urge you to join us in 2 weeks because it'll provide you with substance, information, analysis as to what's in store for Israel now that we are in the 4th round of elections in 2 years, with quite a few projecting that this won't be the last one. So I hope this will not cause you physical or intellectual indigestion, and I urge you to join us to discuss this. Judge Buxbaum, the floor and the microphone is yours.
Well, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to have Professor Rivka Weill back with us. Of the delights of having gotten involved as a volunteer with Hadush, not only meeting Uri and Gordon, but totally unexpected delight was the chance to interact with Professor Weill and reading her material on constitutional law and finding so much fascinating in her analysis. So she originally was going to talk to us about constitutional law. She's a professor at the Radzyner Law School at the IDC. She's visited at Chicago and Yale and Cardozo, and her, if you look at her bio and her writings, she seems to write articles as naturally as most of us breathe. It's an impressive set of writings that I've read, some of which I treasure, and it's a treat to have her back with us for I think the 4th time. We were going to have her talk about constitutional law, but she had a better idea, which is much more pressing, which is what is going on in Israel with its response to the coronavirus. But she also promised to do the constitutional law later. So we didn't, this is not an either or proposition. We will have her back. But the questions we asked, and you saw them in the invitation, were, what do Israel's responses to the pandemic tell us about Israel's society? How have the power relationships between the Knesset and the government and between sections of the population who are resisting government intervention impacted the handling of the crisis? And then how have the courts responded? Those are a few questions to get us started. She will speak to us for about 40 or 45 minutes, and we hope to have ample time for questions afterwards. And I'm sure after she's done speaking, we will defer to Uri for at least the first set of questions. With that, I'd like to ask Professor Weill to begin her talk.
So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. I very much enjoy the conversations with you, and I'm always challenged by the questions. So thank you for the great opportunity. I'm going to concentrate on Israel's unique response to Corona as a part of the story of Israel's response to the coronavirus is shared with the rest of the world. And we all live in this daily crisis, and we live in an era that we have never experienced before. And the first comment that I want to make before I go into the Israeli story is that for Americans, the use of comparative constitutional law is not taken for granted. Actually, the US Supreme Court does not accept, in general, the legitimacy of the use of comparative constitutional law to determine constitutional questions. This is considered to be against the very sovereignty of the state. And we are not going to see probably any change in that attitude in light of the fact that there is now a conservative majority on the US Supreme Court, which will probably adhere to some kind or some form of an originalist interpretation of the US Constitution. But outside the US, it's quite common to use comparative constitutional law to compare other countries' responses to a common problem. And at times of COVID, this attitude makes sense, right? We read newspapers, we hear the media, all the time we are doing comparisons in order to weigh the proportionality of our responses to such a pandemic. And in Israel, not only do we use comparative constitutional law, but it actually is, in a way, it's the reverse of the attitude of the US Supreme Court. What is fascinating today when you hear court discussions is that the court many times asks, what do other countries do? Is anyone doing it? If not, that is a factor that weighs heavily against an act of the government. And we saw it also in the court's discussions with regard to the response to coronavirus. So as the Israeli Supreme Court treats COVID and treats the constitutionality of responses to COVID, the court asks questions such as, is it the less intrusive means of dealing with the pandemic? Do we properly weigh the costs and benefits of a measure? And all that is affected by comparative constitutional law. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to, as I've mentioned, I'm not going to discuss the common story with other countries, but actually the unique aspects of Israel's response to the pandemic. So actually the first cases of COVID in Israel occurred around February 2020. And in March 2020, Israelis went to the polls for the third time within 12 months. And that is actually unprecedented in Israel's history. Now, Israel has a parliamentary system, which means we do not vote for an executive, we vote only for parliament, and the executive enjoys the confidence of the legislature in order to rule. And we have a proportional representation election method, which means that this produces a multi-party system. So the combination of a parliamentary system with a proportional representation election method means that we have unstable governments in Israel. Governments in Israel last on average around 2 years. But 2 years, it's not a situation in which you go to the poll 3 times in 12 months. And as Uri mentioned before we actually started this session, we are now going to the polls for the 4th time in 2 years. So we have a unique story here. There is an interesting meeting of a COVID crisis with a political crisis. So I want to give you 2 major explanations to the political stalemate that Israel is facing. And the first explanation has to do with the ultra-Orthodox service to the army, or the lack of ultra-Orthodox participation in the Israeli army. So let me elaborate a little bit on that. In Israel, every young person by the age of 18 must draft to the Israeli army. It's not a matter of choice, it's a duty. Israel does not draft Israeli Arabs in the sense that they are not coerced to serve, they can volunteer to serve. And the understanding is that this is done as a matter of affirmative action. But when it comes to the ultra-Orthodox community, the situation is very different. Actually, this is part of compromise that was reached by David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, when the state was established. But over the years, the problem got new dimensions. The amount of Israeli citizens that do not serve in the army has grown to such an extent that it became a burning issue, in the sense that they do not also participate in the workforce like other people. They do not risk their lives like other Israeli citizens. So that became a major political and legal issue in Israel. So in the last 10 years, there were 2 statutes that tried to reach a compromise on this matter. But the statutes were twice invalidated by the Israeli Supreme Court as actually infringing on the equality of Israeli citizens. The argument was that the statutes do not lead to greater enrollment of the ultra-Orthodox community in the army. They are not reaching their purpose. So in a way, the court contributed to the political stalemate because it found the statutes unconstitutional. And even though in recent years, right-wing political parties won elections, they were not able to form a government inter alia because of this thorny issue of ultra-Orthodox participation in the Israeli army. And this is a major issue, has tremendous effects, and we can talk about that later on. The second reason for the political stalemate actually has to do with personal politics. It has to do with the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. So this is the more known, I think, reason by now. We have for the first time, there are many firsts in this story. So we have for the first time an indicted prime minister. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is accused of committing serious offenses involving bribery, involving fraud, misuse of office. Now, we did have in the past situations in which prime ministers were indicted, presidents were indicted, we have even convicted prime ministers and presidents. We are blessed. But I'm obviously smiling, but we never had a case of a sitting indicted prime minister that is unwilling to resign. So as a result of that, there are political parties who are not willing to sit with an indicted prime minister. So elections in Israel by now became a referendum on the issue of Benjamin Netanyahu. Are we for Benjamin Netanyahu? Are we against Benjamin Netanyahu? And this is another major political price that the Israeli society is paying because of the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is not resigning and is holding to office. Okay, so the combination of these 2 facts, the ultra-Orthodox lack of service and the indictment, led to political stalemate. And what is interesting is that Kovid actually created an opportunity for the political parties to reach a unity government, despite the fact that those forming the unity government promised before elections that they would never sit together. Right? So they broke their election pledges, they broke their promises to the voters, and they used the excuse that this is an emergency, we need a unity government, and they created a new creature in Israeli law, a co-headed government by 2 prime ministers, and they were the ones to deal with the crisis. So we're talking about Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, who together formed a unity emergency government. Now, the fact that there were special circumstances of COVID and a political stalemate actually enhanced, paradoxically, the government's power in comparison to what would have been otherwise true. So in a sense, the government turned the weakness into a strength. And the government used two unique tools to fight against COVID. And I'm talking about two unique tools in comparative terms, because I'm focusing on the unique part of the story. So the first tool is emergency regulations, and the second tool is the use of the Israeli Shin Bet, or the Israel General Security Services. So let me talk first about the emergency regulations. What is this creature? So emergency regulations are issued by the government, and they, under Israeli law, may override a statute. So you have here an outstanding creature in the sense that under regular rule of law principles, the government is subject to the law. The government must abide by the law. And here we have a situation in which the government may issue emergency regulations and they may override a statute, the opposite. So this is an extraordinary authority. In order to use such an authority, there must be a declaration of an emergency in place in the state. And that emergency declaration must be done by the Israeli legislature. Luckily, Israel is uniquely positioned to deal with an emergency crisis. And this is because since the foundation of the Israeli state, there is a constant emergency declaration by the Israeli Knesset. At first, it was a declaration that never lapsed. And then over time, Israel changed its laws, and now the declaration has a sunset provision. It lasts for only a year, and it has to be renewed, but it's automatically renewed each year. And this enabled Israel to be in a unique position to actually fight against COVID. Now, mind you, the declaration has nothing to do with the health crisis. It has everything to do with the security crisis. This does not matter. This enabled the government to use the emergency regulation tool. And there was a petition to the court. It didn't help. We'll get to the story of the court in a short time. Now, but this is not enough. So this is an outstanding authority. And as a result of that, under the law, you cannot use this authority, but you can use it only in a particular situation in which the legislature cannot convene, cannot enact. But there is an Israeli legislature, so why resort to emergency regulations? Ask the Knesset to enact. And here is where the government made its weakness into strength. Because what the government argued was, listen, it's transition time. You know, we are a caretaker government forever. The Knesset, it takes its time to organize after elections. So actually we fit the definition that the Knesset cannot convene, the Knesset cannot enact. So we must use emergency regulations. Okay, I think we get the story. Now, the emergency regulations lapse after 3 months. You can only renew it by a statute of the Knesset. Eventually, it was renewed by a statute of the Knesset. And today we have a special framework statute to deal with COVID-19. But as you know, the way a story starts affects how it continues, right? So the very fact that the government embarked on the process using such an outstanding authority obviously affected the kind of tools later on codified in a statute. Okay, so this is one aspect. Another aspect is the use of the Shin Bet. And we're talking about the General Security Services. They are famous for fighting terror, for protecting Israel's security. They're also known because of the famous torture case in which the Israeli Supreme Court decided that you cannot torture even suspects of terror. In any case, the General Security Services, what do they have to do with COVID? So here is, again, the government arguing, listen, we have a crisis. And we need to resort to the extraordinary capabilities of the Israeli government to fight the crisis. And how do we want to use the General Security Services? We want to use them in the following way. When the Minister of Health knows of an identified sick person, the Minister of Health notifies, the ministry notifies the Shin Bet that there is an identified sick person. Then the General Security Services of the State of Israel intrude on citizens' privacy. They track their movement through their phones. They go back 14 days and they track all the people that have been in touch or have been in proximity to the sick person, and they notify them that they have been exposed to COVID and they should quarantine for 14 days. Right? So, you know, if you let your General Security Services intrude your privacy without your permission, you know, maybe to give me some kind of a gift, I don't know, maybe, you know, something nice. No, it's in order to tell you to quarantine for 14 days. So this is without, you know, the consent of Israeli citizens. This is done in opaque ways. There is no transparency. We don't really know what software does the security services use, what kind of technological capabilities do they have, and it's not like you are intruding on the privacy of people because you have a judicial order. There is no judicial order. It's not even that you're trying to prevent, you know, someone breached the law. You're talking about intruding on the privacy of citizens that are law-abiding citizens. Okay, so we get the general picture. These are two major tools that are not used in other countries and very unique to Israel. Okay, now I want to give you a sense a little bit, you know, what kind of, you know, individual rights are being infringed. And by the way, my talk is about constitutional law in the real sense of the word. It's not about what I promised in advance. It's not about Banka Mizrahi, which I promised to give a different talk, but it's totally about constitutional law in the sense of individual rights that are being infringed in Israel. So what kind of constitutional rights are being infringed? So just to give you a sense, all over the world, constitutional rights are being infringed. But let's understand the intensity of the infringement in Israel. So when the only international airport that Israel has was open, you would enter Israel and you would be asked to quarantine for 14 days. Okay, Israel is not the only country. Once you quarantined, you would get a unique visit from a policeman to make sure that you are quarantined, right? Even if there is no reason to suspect that you do not quarantine. I can tell you from firsthand that I got such a visit. Other people testify that the police doesn't have enough workforce, so they got a visit of a drone, making sure that they are actually quarantining. Right? You get a sense. Okay, we had 3 lockdowns, and during the 3 lockdowns, people were not allowed to be beyond 1 kilometer from their home. They couldn't go farther than 1 kilometer unless they were essential workers. Now, I can attest, I'm currently in Tel Aviv, that I heard policemen asking people walking innocently on the street to go home, because walking on the street amounts to gathering, and gathering is not allowed. Today, as we speak, the only Israeli international airport is pretty much closed for almost a month. And even though basic law, human dignity and liberty, which is part of Israel's constitution, guarantees that every citizen can enter Israel. Every person can leave Israel under the basic law, but every citizen has a constitutional right to enter Israel. This is infringed, and there are exceptions made on humanitarian grounds, special committee. We had a situation in which you needed to quarantine in hotels. Now you may be able to quarantine at home. This is a major infringement on constitutional rights. Okay, so let me bring into the picture a new player. And the new player is the court. So the Israeli Supreme Court is uniquely positioned to supervise government's actions. Because, and if you remember in my previous talks with you, we talked a little bit about the fact that the Supreme Court is not only the last court of appeal, but it has a special capacity to act as the High Court of Justice, which means that any citizen can decide to wake up in the morning and petition the court directly, the Israeli Supreme Court, to petition the court and argue that, there is a grievance against government action, that the citizen argues that something is wrong with government action. Okay, now there are barely any standing requirements, barely any justiciability requirements, easy, open access to the court, and friendly user rules. Right? No fee, you don't need necessarily an attorney, easy access. So the court actually got involved in the management of the crisis. Dozens of petitions to the Israeli Supreme Court to deal with and to supervise the government's behavior. Okay, so many critics in Israel argue that the court has not been doing a great job at protecting individual rights. And you get from the story already the extent of the infringement, and we do live in a crisis time, right? So it's very easy to criticize when you are not the decision maker, right? But many critics argue that the court has not been doing enough. I would like to suggest that in the shadow of the court, the government did weigh its options and did restrict its behavior in comparison to what would have occurred if not for the supervising role of the court. But the court intervened. These are the few achievements of the court. So for example, the court, when there was a petition against the use of the General Security Services, the court has decided that you can do it on an interim basis, not beyond April 30. If you want to do it beyond, you must have a new authorizing statute. So the court involved the Knesset in the process of the use of the Shin Bet. And even until April 30, the court stated, if you want to use the General Security Services, the Knesset must convene at once. The Knesset must form committees at once. So the court assisted the transition of power process in Israel. Now, having experienced just now January 6th, right? You shouldn't take it for granted, right? Transition, peaceful transition of power, democracy. You know, this is big deal these days. So the court did help in that sense. The court did help in the sense that it required a new authorizing statute for the Shin Bet. The court is, there are many petitions still hanging or still pending, but the court, for example, carved out an exception for the media. So sources will not be exposed as a result of the General Security Services surveillance. So let me a little bit give you an explanation why so far the court's job has been quite limited. It played a very limited role in protecting rights. And I want to suggest two explanations. The first is the precautionary principle. Okay, what's the precautionary principle? This is the following idea, or the following thesis, that if you anticipate a great catastrophe, then even if the likelihood is low, and you cannot really evaluate the likelihood, because it's a great catastrophe, then you can utilize extraordinary measures. Otherwise, would otherwise be perceived as unconstitutional. So the court used these terms in some of its decisions. Now, in general, when we balance, right, when we balance rights, constitutional rights, interests, we ask ourselves, what is the gravity of the risk, both to the public interest and to constitutional rights? And we ask ourselves, what is the likelihood of the gravity materializing, right? If there is we want to take into account both considerations. So the precautionary principle suggests that when the gravity, the danger is so big, you can have a very low likelihood of it actually materializing. And nonetheless, the court would allow great infringement of rights. So this is a very problematic justification for infringement of rights. It is used by the Israeli Supreme Court. And now I want to explain to you that the second theory to what's happening here, the second explanation for my part. We know from American history, for example, that the courts are better able, in times of danger, in times of crisis, they are better able to supervise separation of powers principles than they are able to protect individual rights. And the famous Youngstown case comes to mind, right? You remember the Steel Scissor case in the US, right? In the 1950s, the Korean War, President Truman actually seizes takes over private property, decides to actually take over steel mills, and the US Supreme Court decides, no, you cannot do it. And there is an explanation. The explanation is that the executive authority is at its peak when it enjoys the authority, when it enjoys the concurrent consent of the legislature, when it enjoys legislative authority. So the court wants that government action will be done in combination with a legislative authorization. And this is the famous Youngstown case, but it applies to Israel. What the court has been able to better do is to ask the Knesset to get involved, to supervise, but it has not been able to help much with the protection of individual rights. Okay, now I want to bring in another aspect to Israel's management of the COVID crisis. And these are the unique resources that Israel used in its fight against the pandemic. And here, first of all, Israel utilized the army. So we have the army, we have the people's army, everyone needs to serve, except for those who don't. And in any case, the government decided to use the army to help manage the crisis. Now, what is interesting is that the government tried to use the army as a second line of defense, in the sense that the government, that the army will assist local municipalities, will assist the Ministry of Health to deal with the crisis, but will not enforce COVID regulation directly on Israeli citizens. So that was the aspiration. The reality is different. By now, the army is involved in questioning people to make sure that, to verify whether they were exposed to COVID patients or not. The army has been involved in quarantining, in the quarantine of people in hotels. So also on that front, the story is a mixed story. Now, the army also, there are benefits to the army's involvement in the sense that the army is running a ward in the north to admit patients. And we saw it also in the US when, you know, the ship came to New York, right, to admit patients. So there are good aspects of the story, but there are also red lines that have been crossed. Now, the second point I want to make is the use of the Israel's public health system. So this is another major resource that Israel can utilize in its fight against the pandemic. So in contrast to the US, where you have a major, right, political dispute over Obamacare and over the Affordable Care Act, and you have to be very thankful for what you do have. In Israel, we have a statute that guarantees to every resident a public health insurance. And that promised an infrastructure in the community to deal with COVID. So everything was ready, actually. Everything was in place to enable a quick rollout of the vaccination process. And as a result of that, we are actually number one, I think, by now in the world, in the pace of immunization within a community. And I think that this is one of the lessons of countries around the world, that you cannot, right? You cannot assume that you can rely only on a private market for healthcare, because it's not enough that you are wealthy and you have health insurance. If your neighbor is poor, it doesn't mean that you are going to be safe. So in any case, not only that enabled the government a quick rollout of the vaccination, but it also enabled the government to leverage its position vis-a-vis the vaccination companies to reach agreements to get the vaccination quickly. Okay, so supposedly I'm telling you so far a story in which Israel has greatly infringed on individual rights, right, in order to fight a pandemic, and used extraordinary resources. So supposedly we should have been in a great place. We should have been in a place where we don't have many sick people, we don't have many dead people, but that is not the case. Actually, the rate of infection, there have been many sick people in Israel, even in comparative terms, and we have over 5,000 dead people in a population of 9 million. So in that sense, the story is not a success story. And why is that so? And I want to suggest that actually here's where we see the effects of the politicization of the management of COVID. We have not been able to fight effectively COVID because of politics. So I want to give you a few examples to get a sense, and I'm not covering all issues. I'm not covering all issues in the lecture in general. It's just giving you tastes. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is actually an unequal enforcement of the regulation of COVID. So at first, the government was willing to have local lockdowns. If there was a community that was not abiding by the regulation, or there was a peak in sickness, there was a local lockdown. And there are even interesting stories that during Passover, before Passover, the army distributed food to the Orthodox communities that were in lockdown. And there was even criticism from the Orthodox community that the army was involved. In any case, later on, the government decided that probably, this is a hypothesis, but probably that it doesn't want to pay the political price of enforcing COVID in a local way, and it preferred to have general lockdowns to local lockdowns. It didn't want to pay the price in particular in specific communities that would afterwards affect it during elections. So we had situations in which, especially the ultra-Orthodox community, but not just them, infringed and openly disobeyed regulations, and the regulations were not enforced. So this is one major issue. And actually today, and I need to thank Uri for sending me that article, today actually a few students petitioned the Israeli High Court of Justice to argue against the unequal enforcement of Israeli regulations, in the sense that they are students, they're at home since almost the beginning of the school year, while their peers in the ultra-Orthodox communities, in many of those communities, have been attending school against the regulation. Okay, so this is one aspect. A second aspect is actually the Abraham Accords. So you remember that actually we have the Abraham Accords, and that this, in a way, was a celebration, and in general is accepted positively by the Israeli public. And in order to cement the relationship with Dubai, with United Emirates, the government encouraged people to fly there, to visit those places. Now, how do you encourage people to fly these days? You promise them that when they return, they don't need to quarantine. They don't even need to do an exam to make sure that they are not sick. So while people returning from Europe or people returning from the United States had to quarantine for 14 days, people returning from Dubai, United Emirates, went about their business. And that contributed to the spike in cases of COVID. Okay. Another example I want to give you is actually a major story, and this is the story of the prisoners' vaccination. So we have prisoners in Israel. They are the responsibility of the state, right? We are actually the ones to send them to jail. We should make sure that they are healthy. And the Minister of Interior Security decided that they should not be immunized until we see the pace of immunization in the general community. Now, the Minister of Health stated that this is unacceptable, that actually they should be immunized first. They should be prioritized together with the wardens. And there's actually no shortage of vaccinations, you know. Okay, this debate reached the Attorney General of the State of Israel, and the Attorney General stated that preventing immunization from prisoners is against the law. It infringes on constitutional rights. In Israel, a prisoner may be curtailed in his or her right to liberty, but they definitely maintain the right to dignity and right to health, and they should be immunized. And actually, the minister is acting against his authority because this is the authority of the Minister of Health and not the Minister of Interior Security. Okay, so now you get now we get the hit. So the Minister of Interior Security, Ohana, tells the Attorney General, Mr. Attorney General, if you want to run the country, run for elections, you do not determine policy. I'm the one to determine policy. There was a petition to the court. In the shadow of the petition, within a week, all the prisoners who wanted got vaccination because the story was not to prevent immunization from prisoners. The story was about the conflict between the representative branches and the legal branch. And the idea here was the Attorney General is the one who indicted Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And he's the one that actually we need to curtail his authority, and this is the idea of the Minister Ohana. And you have to understand the heat of the conflict. The Attorney General of the State of Israel wears two hats. It's both the head of the prosecution, and it's also the legal advisor to the government. Now, as the legal advisor to the government, he does not issue opinions that are advisory. He issues opinions that are binding on the government. If the government wants to disobey, it needs the court to rule that actually the Attorney General is wrong and this is not the law. And then there is another problem. For the government to state its position in front of the court, it needs the permission of the Attorney General. If the Attorney General does not allow the government to have a private attorney to state the government's case in front of the court, then only the opinion of the Attorney General is in front of the court. So there is a major conflict in Israel about the authority of the Attorney General, and this translated into a conflict over vaccination of prisoners in Israel. So the conflict was all about politics and not about prisoners' rights. So I want to conclude, because I'm sure you have many questions and there's so much more to discuss. But I want to conclude that we are now going to the polls for the fourth time. And these are grave elections. There are serious issues on the line, because maybe for the first time, we are closer than ever to a situation in which there may be a counter-revolution, rolling back actually some aspects of the constitutional revolution of the 1990s. There are political parties who state as their aim to curtail court power, to curtail the powers of the Attorney General. And the COVID crisis, in a way, contributed to the dynamics in the political field and in the legal field in such a way that it enabled new opportunities to all sides that were not available before. So it would be very interesting to see whether actually these elections can be a turning point into greater reconciliation, or would it be elections that will lead to a further backlash against the judiciary and the legal forces in Israel? So I would stop with that.
Oh, that was quite something. You took us around the world from repression and restriction of individual rights to failure to enforce in a couple of key situations, and then a legal standoff with respect to the prisoners. So we got quite a tour of the Israeli constitutional scene there. As promised, I know my friend Uri has probably 8 questions, so we'll at least let him ask a few to get the discussion rolling. But thanks so much for that talk. It was incredibly enlightening.
Thank you.
Uri?
Thank you, Professor Weill. There are a few Israelis on this call, but most of you are from overseas. So I do want to say that it's a privilege every time Professor Weill comes to this forum and presents us her views and research in our webinars. Even for Israelis, she has enlightened me and I'm sure many others beyond what the average Israeli actually understands in terms of the complexity and the constitutional complexity of the situation, let alone those from overseas. I think it's been a wonderful opportunity to have a deeper understanding of these and related issues. And I want to ask one question and make 2 brief comments. One is that we have been speaking here a number of times, and Professor Weill certainly was an integral part of trying to clarify that Israel is in the midst of a constitutional battle, constitutional crisis, however you want to call it. It wasn't generated, as Professor Weill said, by the COVID-19, but it certainly has been exacerbated by it. Maybe at some other point, when you discuss Mizrahi and Marbury versus Madison, maybe it would be a good opportunity to also speak further about the unique role of the Attorney General in Israel, in the sense that had the Israeli government not been so dismissive, so I don't know what the word, careless, when it comes to issues of the rule of law and respect for the law and for upholding the law and the limitations that the law imposes on them, maybe it wouldn't have been so critical. But the idea of an attorney general who, short of a judicial decision, is guiding and binding the arms of the state on all matters regarding the proper interpretation of the law and the assurance that the executive branch acts within the limits of its office, is essential to protect civil liberties and the rights of citizens. And the countermeasure or the counter assault, for instance, is used not just in terms of the law, but in terms of the rhetoric. So all of a sudden, the Attorney General and all the legal advisors of the ministries are labeled by the likes of Minister Ohana when he was Minister of Justice, and now when he's Minister of Domestic Security, as clerks, pkidim. So imagine those senior legal officials are reduced rhetorically to clerks in order to basically marginalize them and artificially portray the difference between those who are the law enforcing agencies and the elected officials. The second point is that Professor Weill alluded to it, especially at the beginning, that much of the COVID, and later on, much of the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic, as it unfolds in Israel, has to do with the ongoing conflict over religion and state. I think we cannot over-exaggerate that. The reference that Professor Weill made was to the initial battle between what was potentially effective and lasted very short time, namely differential enforcement and enforcing restrictions on communities and neighborhoods where there was a high rate of COVID, as opposed to a liberal and lax rules regarding communities and neighborhoods where there was very little. The ultra-Orthodox politicians resented this notion to the point, as Professor Weill mentioned, that instead of, a fine-tuned policies, Prime Minister Netanyahu preferred to put the whole country in lockdown in order not to have the ultra-Orthodox politicians be able to say, you are discriminating against us, you are singling us out. And the example of the petition that was submitted yesterday by those students is just one example, namely, whereas basically all the Israeli schools are closed down for most of this period, as Professor Weill said. There was a study by Haifa University scholars that was published a few months ago, and further analysis that was publicized about a couple of weeks ago. Most of the enforcement has been done with regard to breaches of the corona rules in Arab towns, and the lowest level of police enforcement has been in the ultra-Orthodox cities and neighborhoods. This is mind-boggling. Most of the enforcement has been done according to the police statistics, by police basically walking the streets and latching on to innocent Israelis who are walking around possibly without a mask. Statistically, most of the reports, the violations, the citations that have been issued were to those who were walking without masks. Hardly any were done with regard to the mass weddings, mass funerals, and the hundreds of schools in the ultra-Orthodox community that continued operating almost without any limitation. We could talk more, but I think it's important, especially in this forum, to understand the ongoing connection between many of Israel's societal challenges and now health challenges and the unholy bond, the unholy alliance of religion and state. And the one brief question to Professor Weill, it's back to you in a second. And that is a very serious issue that has been discussed in Israel, has been criticized by the Prime Minister and his allies, and that's the issue of the freedom to demonstrate and the ability of large-scale demonstrations to continue in spite of the prohibition on assembly, and the question of how do you feel about the distinction between the right to demonstrate and the prohibition on assembly, viewing it as an avenue that promotes contracting the virus?
Thank you so much. I want first to, and thank you again for the opportunity and for the invitation. I want first to focus on the ultra-Orthodox community. And I want to say the following. The comparison between the ultra-Orthodox community and the Arab community is interesting in the sense that the leadership of the Arab community weighed in and was willing and even asked for help in enforcement of COVID regulations to lower the numbers of COVID cases, because in the beginning, also the Arab community suffered from very high rates of COVID in comparison to the general population. But it seems that the leadership was taking control of the situation, was willing to actually work with law enforcement, and even asked for help. And when you look at the ultra-Orthodox community, we are talking about it as a monolithic community, but it's not. And the sad part of the story is that instead of enhancing the powers of those who wanted regulations to be enforced, instead of helping those that wanted to protect their lives, actually the government enabled a free hand to violators of the law and the leaders of the community that actually encouraged violations of the law. And there is a connection, a set connection between the story of the draft to the army and the story of the enforcement of the regulations, that the Israeli society in a way is carving out exceptions time and again to the ultra-Orthodox community. And the time comes when, you know, everyone's paying the price. And in this case, in COVID, it became clear. And it's a sad story because the ultra-Orthodox community has been more affected by COVID than other communities, even in comparison to the percentage of the population. And what is also said is that this is a poor community, right? So we know also from the United States, we know from all over the world, that poor communities are communities that suffer more from COVID cases. They live in more dense conditions. Their conditions of life are such that COVID can affect them more. And instead of taking that into account and protecting their own communities, the leaders of the community enabled intentionally to have schools open, to disregard the regulations. So it's a very sad story, and the government definitely has a contributing part in this story. Okay, so this is one thing I wanted to add to the comments that Rabbi Regev, or if I may, Uri, have elaborated. With regard to the question of the demonstration, so this is another interesting aspect of the story that is still unfolding, but because there is a pending petition to the Israeli High Court with regard to the right to demonstrate. So the thorny issue is the following. When we had lockdowns, you could not live beyond 1,000 meters, right? You needed to stay within the parameters of your dwelling. Now, people wanted to demonstrate, and they wanted to demonstrate specifically in front of Netanyahu's residence, or in Jerusalem, in the place where a demonstration counts. And not just that, even beyond that, you want the amount of people demonstrating matters for demonstration purposes, right? What's a demonstration? A demonstration is to demonstrate, to show your strength, to show your conviction. So you need the numbers. So the argument was that even during lockdowns, you should enable different kinds of demonstrations. For example, to go in cars and flags and demonstrate, or find other less intrusive means of enabling protest while protecting the public health. And this is currently in front of the court. There is no decision yet. Now, in Israel, what is interesting is that there was a comparison, or there was a debate. Is the right to demonstrate similar or different from the right to congregate, right? From the right to daven together, the right of synagogues to congregate. And here, so there were opinions on both sides of the spectrum. But here what is interesting is that supposedly once you have a minyan, once you have 10 people, right, you can have a synagogue, and you can have a synagogue within the 1,000 meter area. So actually, people were having minyanim, people were having, they could congregate, or they could have small congregations, but they could have nonetheless, even with COVID. And the right to demonstrate in that sense is different, because here, you know, the 10 number rule doesn't apply, and the power of the numbers matter. So it's a thorny issue. People may have different opinions on that, but this is again where the argument of politicization of the process came in, because some have argued that lockdowns were driven also by Prime Minister Netanyahu's desire to silence protest against him. Now, is that true? I don't know, and I'll tell you why I'm hesitant. And I'm hesitant not just because of the numbers of COVID, I'm hesitant also in the following sense. You need to understand who is the government of Israel. The government of Israel is composed of multiple party members that belong to different parties. Right? So actually sitting in the same government are people who don't like each other, even the state, you know, they hate each other. So in order for actually to have lockdowns, even if you overrule the Knesset, you need actually cooperation from within the government. And that is not a given. So I'm not sure on that front, but you know, it's an argument that has been made in Israel. So Uri, I'm not giving you a definite answer, because it's, you know, I prefer to give the complexity of the issue. But I am between the lines. I think you could have heard. You had somewhat of an answer.
There was a question from Nancy Kaplan. I think I can boil it down to: are the elections likely to provide any way out, or is there any way out, or are we just doomed to failure in the COVID response because of the ultra-Orthodox unwillingness to cooperate and the government unwillingness to enforce? Do you have any thoughts on that? So
I think there's, I will take the question and answer it with I will add an additional issue to the question. So the numbers are going down in Israel in terms of COVID. Vaccinations are working. So supposedly, in terms of opening the international airport of Israel, the numbers suggest that you even taking into account the seriousness of the illness, supposedly, you know, I can't understand how it's not open. What is interesting is that there is the immunity issue of the Prime Minister of Israel. This is a topic that is hanging over these elections. And it seems like there are suggestions, Netanyahu is rather quiet about it, that Netanyahu may want actually, if he succeeds, create a coalition that gives him immunity from the trial. And I think that I don't see any kind of statute or basic law that could constitutionally grant him such immunity. It will fail. It will fail the court test. Now, if that issue could have been put aside, like that, understanding that this is not in the game, immunity is not in the game. This is the very basic rule of law principle, that everyone's equal in front of the law. You need to, you know, you'll have your day in court, whatever will be decided will be decided. Once this is put to the side, how this will affect actually possible coalitions in Israel, possible formations, I don't know. But this issue should have been out of the game completely. And it is out of the game. This is the interesting part. Even though someone is dreaming of a situation of immunity, it is out of the game legally. Again, there's no constellation, no basic law, no statute, nothing that could actually grant him such immunity that would pass the court test, unless, you know, someone wants to demolish the courts. I'm, you know, okay.
Okay. I guess we discussed this briefly, and if you think this is beyond the pale, you don't have to, but we have the recent statements by the religious parties that they will boycott any involvement by labor because of the reform rabbi that is going to be part of the, could be part of the labor list, or is part of the labor list. Does that tie into what you've been discussing in terms of the split in the Israeli society and the inability to come to terms with some of these COVID issues?
I first of all see this dispute as the equivalent to the prisoner's story that I've told you. It's a story about creating a storm. That's how I may be wrong. This is my interpretation, but it's a story about creating a storm, getting attention. These elections are so much about Netanyahu that no issues are discussed. So everything is personal politics. So now you get personal politics with Gilad Kariv, right? But so you get attention, you get media coverage, you get, you know, fire and storms. But I don't see it as a real issue because I don't even envision a situation in which the Labour Party would be needed for coalition, and because of Kariv, this would not happen. I'm first of all answering in a practical way, and I'm answering in a practical way when you think of a response to someone who is trying to provoke you, and you understand that he's trying to provoke you, then you can think about how you want to respond, understanding that this is actually a provocation and not necessarily a real thing. So I think that this is a provocation. Obviously, it's unacceptable on any, you know, on constitutional, on any grounds. But that's how I see it: a cynical provocation to reach the media. Uri, do you agree with me or you disagree?
Well, I put it in more cynical terms, namely, if they can get away with excluding labor and making it appear as if Rabbi Kariv is the cause for that, and still be in a coalition and receive the benefits emanating from it, they will prefer that. But there is no question in my mind that if they needed to join with labor in order to remain in the coalition, that Rabbi Kariv would not be the obstacle that would keep them out.
Yeah, yeah.
We also worry about what happened in our country on January 6th, that people repeat stuff long enough, other people start believing it. So that's a concern as well, I would think.
Though I have to say that in Israel, fortunately, it actually plays the other way too. Namely, this kind of extremist exclusionary views and assault that is coupled with other areas in which the ultra-Orthodox generate frustration in the eyes of the general public, such as now the schools and the draft, etc., and there are many other, and the lack of public transportation on Shabbat, etc. All of that generates further anger towards the Haredi leadership and the Haredi community, rather than people buying into their assault.
Well, it's about time to wrap up, so I'm going to ask both of you, is there anything cheerful you can tell us by way of a final comment after all the difficulties that have been, that you've both exposed?
I think there is a question on the chat. We may want to address it. So can the person who is asking the question, so can that person actually speak?
Let's unmute Nancy. One moment.
Do you want me to say a
Oh,
word?
go ahead. Yes. All right.
Okay, I didn't intend to hijack the conversation or anything. I just wanted to make it clear to people that I had a very specific concern about the election law, and that was the way small parties that don't make the threshold are thrown out of the mix and all their votes are thrown away, so that when the total number of votes is used to figure out who wins the government, those voters are completely disenfranchised. And to me, that's a problem with the election law. Will it ever change?
Actually, I think that the threshold should be higher rather than lower, because Israel suffers from instability of government rule. As I've mentioned to you, the statistics, governments last on average 2 years. And the fact that the governments are so weak and they need so many partners to rule is actually paralyzing the government, enabling small parties to extract benefits that otherwise would not have been possible. This is part of the story of special communities getting special treatment that we have been discussing today. So actually you need to raise the threshold. I would actually adopt a 5% threshold in order to remedy the situation. And the idea is to give incentive to political parties ahead of the election to unify. Yeah, there's no other, it's not, even with 5%, you're still, this is very democratic, very proportional. It's not a majoritarian system like the US. We're not going to reach a two-party system. Get the threshold higher and get people united.
Okay, I'm going to, we're about an hour and 15 minutes in. I wanted to thank Professor Weill for an incredible presentation. She led us through an amazing account of repression by the curtailment of individual rights, which, by the way, my son is enjoying very much in Taiwan at the moment, through the emergency declaration, through the Attorney General, through the failure to enforce all the authority that's there. It's an incredible tale, and we've all learned a lot. And with that, I'll turn the floor back to Uri to conclude and to tell us about our next lecture.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
We are grateful to you, Professor Weill. It's wonderful to have you enlighten us, and hopefully those will be listening to the recording of this session, which will be sent out soon. And indeed, one piece of good news is that in 2 weeks, we will meet again with an opportunity to have a better, deeper understanding of the elections that are coming up and what's unique about them and who's playing and what their positions are and what may that hold in store for the post-election time. So March 8th at the same time, same place, and we look forward to seeing you all. And in the meantime, stay healthy and be well. Thank you all. Shalom.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
We'll get you back for the constitutional lecture after all, Professor Weill.
Purim Sameach, Uri.
Shalom. Purim Sameach.